The storm hit with a ferocity Kevin hadn't anticipated. One moment, the sky was a clear, deepening bruise of purple and orange. The next, a wall of cold rain slammed down, soaking his jacket and turning the narrow mountain trail into a slick, treacherous ribbon of mud. He had a choice: risk the long, downhill slog in the darkness, or find a place to wait it out. That's when he saw it: a dark mouth in the side of the rock face, a shallow cave that looked like a perfect, dry sanctuary. The opening was small, just big enough to crouch through, but it promised shelter from the relentless downpour. Kevin was no stranger to the wild, a seasoned backpacker. He'd slept under more stars than most people had seen in a lifetime. A little cave was nothing. He ducked inside, shedding his dripping pack and headlamp. The air immediately turned still and heavy, a profound silence broken only by the distant drum of rain and the of water from the cave ceiling. The smell was ancient and earthy, a mix of wet stone, damp soil, and something else he couldn't quite place. A faint metallic scent like old pennies. He was relieved. He was safe. He set up his small gas stove, the sound of the propane hissing to life, a comforting modern noise, pushing back against the ancient stillness of the earth. He boiled water for a pouch of dehydrated chili, and as he ate, a quiet satisfaction settled over him. This was the wilderness, untamed and unpredictable, and he had met its challenge with foresight and a hot meal. The flickering light from his stove's flame danced on the cave walls, turning the rough surfaces into a gallery of shifting faces and forms. It felt cozy, a small island of humanity in a sea of wild indifference. But as the last light of the day bled from the sky, the cave's silence began to feel less like peace and more like a pressure. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight, thick and velvety. He switched on his headlamp, its beam a solitary, frail spear against the vast unknown. He shone it deeper into the cave, illuminating a corridor of wet rock that seemed to disappear into nothingness. He was surprised by its depth. He had assumed it was a shallow recess, but the tunnel continued beyond the reach of his light, a black maw that promised secrets he didn't want to know. A strange, almost imperceptible chill began to creep up from the interior, carrying a taste of dry, stagnant air. He turned off the headlamp to save the battery and settled into his sleeping bag, the world shrinking to the rhythm of his own breathing. He tried to think of his home, of the city lights and the sound of traffic, but the profound quiet of the cave swallowed his thoughts. That's when he heard the first sound. It wasn't the rain. It was a faint, almost inaudible scrape, followed by a pause. Kevin held his breath. It came again, this time from much deeper within the cave. He told himself it was just a rock shifting, settling with the change in temperature. It was a natural sound. He squeezed his eyes shut and repeated the mantra in his head, clinging to the logic like a life raft. Hours passed. Kevin drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, each drip of water from the ceiling sounding like a footstep. He imagined the cave was just a vessel, and the sounds were its blood, its bones. But then the sound changed. It became an echo. He shifted in his sleeping bag, his synthetic fabric rustling loudly in the quiet. A moment later, from the absolute blackness of the corridor, came the faintest rustle. He froze. The sound was too precise. He cleared his throat, a small, nervous gesture. An instant later, a dry, raspy cough came back to him from the deep, an exact, horrifying replica of his own. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. He wasn't talking to himself. The cave was talking back. The mimicry was subtle at first, just a slight shifting of his weight, answered by a soft thump from the depths. He let out a shaky sigh. The sigh was returned, a breathy, hollow sound that seemed to pass right through him. He fumbled for his headlamp, his fingers trembling with a primal, suffocating fear. He clicked it on, bathing the interior in a frantic beam. He saw nothing, only cold, indifferent rock. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of acoustics, the unique geometry of the cave. But then he saw it. A glint, a flash of something reflective at the very edge of his light's reach, deep in the tunnel. It was gone in an instant, but it wasn't the glint of water on rock. It was too sharp, too deliberate. "Hello?" he called out, his voice thin and small, a sound he barely recognized as his own. His own voice came back, distorted and stretched, but his name, a chilling, elongated whisper, followed. "Kevin?" The sound was bone-dry like a whisper exhaled from a tomb. It wasn't a true echo, it was a repetition, a playback, as if something had been recording him since he first entered and was now playing his sounds back to him deliberately. He scrambled out of his sleeping bag, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to get out. He turned to the entrance, his mind screaming at him to run, but the heavy rain was still coming down in sheets, a solid wall of water that promised a fall or a broken ankle in the darkness. Trapped. He was trapped. He stared into the storm, the white noise of the rain now a terrifying roar, and then he looked back at the deeper darkness of the cave. The lesser of two evils no longer felt like a choice. He kept his headlamp aimed at the dark tunnel, his shadow a monstrous, shaking silhouette on the opposite wall. The whispering began again, a chorus of faint, dry sounds. They weren't just mimicking him anymore. They were like a conversation he couldn't understand, a chittering language from the dark, talking about him. He could almost make out words, fragmented and broken like visitor and warmth, and a possessive, sibilant sound attached to his name. The air grew colder, and that metallic scent from the entrance now hung thick and cloying. Suddenly, the light from his headlamp flickered. The glint returned, this time closer, and not just one. 2 points of light, like tiny, malevolent stars. They blinked once, then twice, and he knew they weren't reflections. They were eyes. A deep, guttural sound, like a wet cough from the throat of a long-dead animal, resonated through the tunnel. He stumbled backward, falling against the cold, wet stone wall. The whispering grew louder, and a new sound joined it. A soft, wet slithering, like something being dragged across a damp surface. The 2 pinpricks of light grew bigger as they approached, no longer just glints, but full, glowing orbs. They were too high to be a small animal, hovering unnervingly at eye level, a foot or 2 from the ground. Kevin felt the air grow colder, not from the rain, but from an unnatural chill that clung to the thing in the dark. He could just make out a vague shape now, something tall and unnervingly thin, a skeletal silhouette against the blackness. He knew it had been there the whole time, a silent audience to his pathetic camp, waiting for him to make a sound, waiting for the storm to trap him. He didn't wait any longer. With a strangled cry, he lunged for the cave entrance, abandoning his gear. The cold rain was a shocking, welcome wash against his skin, a brief moment of sensation that cut through his pure terror. He didn't stop to get his bearings. He just ran, slipping and falling down the muddy trail, the sound of the storm drowning out the fear in his throat. The descent was a nightmare of twisted ankles and bruised knees, but he didn't feel the pain. He just ran, propelled by a singular, desperate need to put distance between himself and the cave. He ran until his lungs felt like they would burst, until he collapsed on a ridge overlooking the valley, the first pale light of dawn, a sliver on the horizon. The storm had passed. He was soaked, bruised, and trembling, but he was alive. As he lay there, staring up at the gray sky, a profound and terrible thought settled over him. He had been so focused on the cave, on the darkness and the whispering within it. He had never once looked back to see what followed him out. The scrape and drag had stopped once he reached the entrance, but he didn't know if that meant he was safe. He heard the sound then, carried on the wind, a faint, dry, single scrape, like a greeting. He looked back up the trail toward the dark mouth of the cave and saw nothing. But from a distance, just as the sun began to warm the earth, he heard a final, chilling whisper on the breeze, like a promise, like a hunger. "Kevin." Richard and Anne were seasoned hikers, their weekends a ritual of tracing trails through the untouched wilderness. The trip to Stonefall Gorge, a 2-day trek known for its breathtaking waterfalls and ancient rock formations, was meant to be their most ambitious yet. They had consulted every map, checked every weather report, and packed every piece of gear with meticulous care. But the wild is a cruel and unpredictable master. A sudden, violent storm, as unpredictable as it was fierce, caught them off guard on their second day. Rain lashed down in thick sheets, turning the winding path into a muddy river. The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing at the trees and erasing the trail markers as if they had never existed, forcing them to seek immediate shelter. They were completely and utterly lost, and the sinking feeling in their stomachs was colder than the rain. They stumbled upon a narrow fissure in the rock face, a dark gash that promised reprieve from the deluge. The cave was nothing more than a shallow cavity, its floor a bed of damp, loose earth, but to them, it was salvation. They scrambled inside, collapsing against the cool stone. The sound of the storm, which had been deafening moments before, was muffled to a dull roar, and they huddled together, the quiet thrum of their fear echoing the rumble of the thunder. They pulled out their emergency blankets, their trembling fingers fumbling with the thin foil, but the cold had already set deep into their bones. As the hours passed and night fell, the storm began to abate, replaced by a profound, chilling silence that felt heavier than the rain had. It was in this new, oppressive quiet that the sound began. It wasn't a roar or a shriek, but a low, rhythmic noise that seemed to resonate not just through the air, but through the very stone beneath them. It was a kind of humming, but not a human one. It was guttural and deep, a sound like a distant, massive engine vibrating in the Earth's core, so low a frequency it felt more than it was heard. Richard strained his ears, his hand instinctively reaching for Anne's, his grip a white-knuckled vice. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice a tremor in the darkness. "It's not the wind." Anne nodded, her eyes wide, reflecting the faint glow of the stars peeking through the clouds outside. "It's coming from inside," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. She pointed a shaky finger toward the deeper recesses of the cave. Deeper in. They tried to rationalize it. A subterranean stream? The wind whipping through a different unseen passage? Perhaps an animal had taken refuge farther inside. But the sound was too constant, too unnatural. It had a deliberate, almost mechanical quality that defied any logical explanation. The humming continued, a sinister lullaby that slowly, meticulously frayed their nerves. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity, the sound a persistent whisper of dread in the back of their minds. After what felt like an eternity, the humming changed. It became higher pitched, almost a whisper, and now they could hear another sound that made the hair on their arms stand up. A soft, dry scratching, as if something with long, sharp nails was slowly, patiently dragging itself across the cave's rough limestone walls. The sound was getting closer, each scrape a tiny pinprick of pure horror that seemed to be counting down to an unseen arrival. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through their exhaustion. They had to know what it was, if only to find a different way out. The humming and scratching were no longer just a noise. They were a siren song pulling them into the darkness. Gathering their last scraps of courage, they switched on their headlamps, their small beams of light piercing the gloom like two fragile spears. The scratching sound was now a distinct, slithering noise, leading them deeper into the cave's black heart. They followed the path it suggested around a sharp bend and into a larger, cathedral-like cavern they hadn't known existed. The air here was thick and still, carrying the scent of ancient stone and something else they couldn't name. The cavern was vast, its ceiling lost in the shadows, its walls slick with moisture that caught the light and made the rock gleam. And in the center of the cavern, bathed in the pale glow of their headlamps, stood a figure. It was a woman, or what resembled one. She was entirely clad in white, her dress a tattered, ancient-looking gown that seemed to hang in the air around her, undisturbed by any breeze. Her skin was a terrifying, translucent white, almost like fine porcelain, and her long hair, the color of bone, drifted around her shoulders, as if suspended in water. But it was her face that stole their breath and froze the blood in their veins. Her eyes were not eyes at all, but two deep, empty sockets that stared into the void, a void that seemed to stare back at them. The skin around the sockets was stretched and thin, like parchment pulled taut over a skull. The scratching sound they had heard was the faint scraping of her fingernails, long skeletal appendages that ended in sharp, pointed tips as they dragged across a large boulder. She was not moving, just standing there, an ancient, motionless statue in the dark. The humming sound they had heard was coming from her, a low, constant vibration that seemed to emanate from her very being, a sound that they now understood was part of her. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over them. This was no ghost or lost hiker. This was something inhuman, a primal being of the rock and the dark, a creature that belonged to this place in a way they could never comprehend. The creature slowly, impossibly, tilted its head. It didn't turn its body, only its head, rotating it at a gruesome, unnatural angle until its empty sockets were fixed directly on them. The silence was absolute, save for the sound of their own ragged breathing. A raw, animal scream caught in Anne's throat. Richard felt his legs give way, but his primal survival instinct took over. "Run!" he bellowed, grabbing Anne's arm. They scrambled backward, their feet slipping on the slick stone, turning to flee as the white figure began to glide toward them. It moved with a silent, horrifying grace, its feet not touching the ground, its form shimmering in the beam of their headlamps like a mirage. The scraping sound was now the only thing they could hear, growing louder, faster, closer, a relentless drumbeat of their impending doom. They burst from the cave just as the first rays of morning light touched the sky, their lungs burning, gasping for air as if they had just been pulled from the bottom of the ocean. They didn't stop to look back, to see if the creature was there, watching them. They simply ran, their clothes torn, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. They found the main trail an hour later, but the world felt different. The cheerful chirping of birds seemed like a cruel joke. The sunlight felt foreign, unable to chase away the deep chill of the cave. The taste of terror still clung to the back of their throats. They never spoke of what they saw. The memory was a wound, an experience so profound it had changed the very fabric of their reality. They knew in the chilling depths of their hearts that they hadn't simply survived a storm. They had stumbled into a place where the veil between their world and something else was thin, and they had seen what lay beyond. The humming was now a phantom sound that would haunt their dreams, and they would forever wonder if, in the deep silence of the night, the White Lady of Stonefall Cave was still humming its song, waiting for its next lost visitor. The four friends, Liam, Chloe, Ben, and Sarah, shared an uncommon bond forged by their collective reverence for the wilderness. While others sought comfort in resorts or city lights, they found their solace in the raw, untamed parts of the world. They were seasoned adventurers, their gear worn and their spirits honed by countless nights under the stars. Their current expedition was to be their most ambitious yet. A full week inside a remote cave system they had discovered on a geological survey map, a place so untouched it didn't even have a name. It was the ultimate test of their self-reliance, a chance to truly disconnect and live in the Earth's silent, enduring heart. The very idea of the journey filled them with a thrill of anticipation, an almost sacred reverence for the profound solitude that awaited them. The cave's entrance was a jagged maw of limestone, cool, damp air smelling of wet earth and ancient minerals billowing out like a sigh. The transition from the sun-drenched, vibrant forest to the dim, hushed world below was immediate and profound. They strapped on their headlamps, their powerful beams cutting through the absolute blackness as they began their descent. They moved with practiced ease, past shimmering quartz veins that caught the light like frozen starlight, and alongside colossal stalactites that dripped with a slow, rhythmic tick, marking a timescale that dwarfed their own. The air grew colder, heavier, and with every step deeper, the forest's world faded into a distant memory, replaced by a deep and pervasive quiet that seemed to press in on all sides. They hiked for 2 miles, their voices growing quieter, their footsteps more deliberate. They found a grand, cathedral-like chamber, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into a darkness their headlamps couldn't touch. The space was awe-inspiring, a natural masterpiece carved by eons of water and stone. It felt sacred, a shelter unlike any they had ever known. They set up their tents on a relatively flat patch of ground, their nylon homes looking like fragile cocoons against the immensity of the rock. They cooked a simple meal, the scent of their camp stove a brief foreign comfort in the pristine air, and settled in for the night. The solitude they had so eagerly sought was enveloping them, a profound silence broken only by the soft rustle of their sleeping bags and the distant, lonely echo of a water droplet. As midnight bled into the early hours, a subtle shift occurred. The silence that had been so comforting now felt heavy, expectant, as if holding its breath. Chloe, ever the most sensitive to her surroundings, was the first to feel it. A faint, grating sound, like a loose rock being dragged across a rough surface, echoed from a far-off passage. It wasn't loud, but in the oppressive silence, it felt as though it was happening right next to her. She nudged Ben awake, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread in the vast space. Ben, bleary-eyed, listened intently. "It's probably just geological activity," he mumbled, a phrase he knew they all used to rationalize strange sounds in the wild. "The cave is settling." He said it with forced conviction, but a prickle of unease had already begun to crawl up his spine. But the sound didn't settle. It grew louder, a slithering, shuffling noise that seemed to be methodically getting closer. The scraping was now punctuated by a soft, wet clicking, like the slow, deliberate knocking together of bones. The rhythm was erratic, a syncopated percussion of dread that seemed to intentionally mock their attempts at calm. Liam and Sarah were now awake, their headlamps casting nervous, dancing beams of light onto the cave walls, the sudden movement revealing their collective anxiety. "That's not settling," Liam said, his voice a tight, low wire. "That's something moving." The realization hung in the air, cold and undeniable. A cold dread took hold of the group. They sat frozen, listening, their own breathing a thunderous roar in their ears. The sound stopped abruptly, and for a long, agonizing minute, there was only silence. A silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure, sucking the air from their lungs and pressing down on their chests. Then a new sound began, a thin, high-pitched scratching, like a dozen fingernails on a rock face, that seemed to come from directly above them. They all pointed their headlamps up in a single, terrified burst of light, and there it was. Crawling along the ceiling, its limbs bent at impossible, contorted angles, was a creature of absolute nightmare. It was skeletal, its skin a pale, translucent white that seemed stretched thin and almost wet over its malformed bones. Its head was too large, its jaw unhinged and slack, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. Its eyes were two black, gaping pits that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, like twin voids in the darkness. It moved with a horrifyingly disturbing, jerky speed, its long, spindly fingers scraping along the rock with the sound of a fingernail on a chalkboard. It wasn't crawling, it was scuttling, its movements twitching and unnatural, like a broken puppet on a thread, its body unnaturally elongated and thin. A sickening stench, like that of a long-dead animal in wet decay, began to waft down from its position on the ceiling. A collective shuddering gasp escaped the group, a single, terrified breath. The creature froze, its empty eyes swiveling to lock on them with an intelligent, horrifying hunger. It let out a sound that was a sickening combination of a hiss and a whisper, a noise that spoke of hunger and an ancient, territorial malice that resonated deep in their bones. "Run!" Liam screamed, scrambling from his tent. They didn't hesitate. Survival instinct overrode all logic. They abandoned their gear, their week's worth of supplies, and carefully prepared plans meaningless in the face of this horror. Their headlamps bobbed wildly as they sprinted, a frantic, desperate dash back the way they came. The scraping and slithering sound followed them, closer now, faster. They could hear the clicking of its jaw, the wet smock of its feet on the damp cave floor. The sound of their own frantic gasps for air. They ran without a thought for their footing, their feet slipping on wet stone, their shoulders hitting jagged rock. Ben fell, his headlamp spinning away into the darkness, but he scrambled back up, his body propelled by pure adrenaline. The image of the creature's black eyes seared into his mind. The creature's silhouette flickered in the periphery of their lights, a grotesque, dancing shadow that was always just out of sight, yet always right behind them, its movements mirroring their panic. The air grew thick with a metallic tang, the scent of fear and the creature's foul odor mixing into a noxious cocktail. Each step was a gamble against a sprained ankle or a broken bone, but the thought of stopping was a far greater terror. After what felt like an eternity, they saw it, the faint, grayish light of the cave entrance, a promise of the sky they had so eagerly left behind. It was a beacon of hope, a goal they ran towards with every ounce of their remaining strength. With one final desperate burst, they stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. They collapsed in the grass outside, sobbing, their muscles screaming. The stars shone down on them, their light a stark contrast to the absolute darkness they had just escaped. They didn't stop to look back, their eyes fixed on the small, dark hole in the side of the mountain, a place of unspeakable horror they would never dare to approach again. The profound silence of the natural world, which they had once cherished, was now a source of deep, abiding terror.